Star Wars The Grey War, Chapter 16, by Nathan Brown.
16. You're holding on too much, Nathir scolded her. You need to use your emotions, let go of your restrictions. To create lightning, you must feel the storm inside you, building up until you can't control it, and then release it. I'm actually surprised someone as clearly well-trained as you hasn't had any experience with force lightning. Keenzer was standing with Nathiera in the training grounds used only by the elites, failing to create Sith lightning. Nathiera had her mask off since they were surrounded by only other elites, and Kinsa got to match her voice to a face for the first time. She was a human woman, about the same size and weight as Kinsa. She had a heart-shaped face, her chin coming to a soft point. She had short, purple-black hair that reached the bottom of her earlobes. Her skin was ashen white and looked even lighter next to her dark hair. She had the yellow eyes customary to all Darksiders, and they were surrounded by purple-black eyeshadow that matched her hair. Marring her otherwise perfect face was a large scar going from her bottom lip to her chin. It was so large it seemed as if the corner of her bottom lip was gone. She had full lips with black lipstick, providing another stark contrast against her pale face. Even with the scar, she had beautiful, delicate features and was undeniably a stunning woman despite the influence of the dark side. Keenzer was in a strange sort of shooting range meant for force lightning, facing a body dummy and trying to conjure electricity from her fingertips. She knew now why she had always had trouble controlling the strange ability. She'd never been someone who released her emotions, or dwelt on her anger and sadness. She had been trained for most of her life to block out and smother her emotions. Even before her time with the Jedi, living as an enforcer for the mob and then a homeless teenager, she had been forced to build a wall to keep her emotions at bay. Now she was being told to throw that all away. She knew she had to do it to fit in and continue her mission, but a part of her worried that she might not be able to control her emotions once she tore down that dam. Dig deep. Find your strongest emotions and let them simmer within you. Nathiera continued, urging her on. Keenza knew the dangers of this activity, but she also knew she didn't have a choice. It was more dangerous not to do it. She had to sacrifice bits of herself for the good of the Jedi and of the galaxy. After all, she told herself, this is what she had always wanted. She thought back to the time before she had been found by Master Rilf. She had been living on Nar Shaddaa, using her force to scare people into paying their debts to her bosses, a small mob organization. They used her because she was small and feminine and could get into almost anywhere, but had learned early on to use the force to augment her strength. Then she had become too famous on the large moon where word traveled fast. She tried to enter a club housing a mark, but she'd been recognized by one of the bouncers and beaten to a pulp. She dragged herself back to her employers, but they turned her away. Since she was no longer a secretive option, there wasn't a point in keeping her around. They left her bruised, broken, and alone. Those feelings were unlocked now, the feelings of helplessness and betrayal she had felt and the anger she had used to mask those emotions. She thought back to how she had felt when the three sorceresses had attacked her in the desert, the vulnerability and confusion. A dark whirlwind formed in the pit of her being and swirled around inside of her, picking up bad memories and emotions, feeding itself and growing larger. Keenza felt herself trembling and she looked down at her hands to see them shaking violently. The whirlwind of darkness continued to spin, gorging itself on all her raw, hidden emotions. It began picking up good things and good memories and shining its dark light on them, exposing their true, Mr. Underbelly. The Jedi, with their useless hypocrisy. Master Rilf, her beloved master who'd taken a fragile girl and twisted her into a robot, an emotionless machine only to be used to fight in the war against the Sith. Her hands started to tremble slightly as the rocking storm within her started to affect her body. It felt terrible. She tried to stop it, tried to protect her precious memories, but she couldn't. All that she thought was good in her life was being taken over by the whirlwind of rage and burned away until only the darkness remained. She just needed this to stop. She needed the pain to end. The shaking in her hands spread to her arms as she raised them up, pointing them at the dummy. She released it, all the terrible emotions and painful, burning memories. A wave of pure searing pain roared through her veins and exploded out her palms. Deep purple, almost black lightning streamed from her hands and shot forth, disintegrating the dummy and burning up the air around her. The lightning continued pouring out of her, spreading wider and burning up the wooden structure around the dummy. She could hear people screaming around her, but she couldn't make out the voices or the words. The flood of emotion stopped and so did the river of lightning. Keenza dropped to her knees. The pain of the lightning and the rush of emotions that had been bottled up for so long proved too much. Kinsa saw Nathira's fuzzy form rush to her side just as the shroud of darkness closed over her completely. Scene change. Slowly Kinsa tore at the fog around her, the pulse smothering her, falling away piece by piece. Her vision cleared and she awoke in the room she had been sleeping in since she'd arrived a couple of days ago to see Nathira and 5 other elites she didn't know with their masks off, staring down at her. "Are you okay, Doreen?" Nathira asked, genuine concern etched across her face. "Give her a bit of space, Nathira," an older Zabrak said. "She just woke up. She'll need some time to adjust." Nathira nodded and all 6 beings took a small step away from her bed. Kinsa placed her hands on the bed to push herself up to a sitting position, but as soon as she put any weight on them, her palms protested, sending a shockwave of pain throughout her body. She yelped in surprise, startling the 6 people around her. She looked down at her hands to see them wrapped in thin bandages. "You burned yourself. We got you wrapped up and you should be fine by tomorrow morning," a short human man spoke out. "The name's Flint," he told her. He had a huge smile on his face. His skin was a cinnamon color and he had short, cropped black hair. "That was amazing what you did yesterday. None of us has seen anything like it." Everyone around the bed nodded slightly in agreement. "Yesterday?" Kinsa asked, her voice still warbly. "How long have I been asleep?" "It was about 15 hours. Our squad has been taking turns waiting for you to wake up." Looking around at the faces crowding her vision, Kinsa saw real care in their eyes. She had never expected followers of the dark side to care for anyone, especially someone they had never met. She was still expecting this to be some trap, that somehow they had found out who she really was and this was all a strange ploy to put her at ease. "Well, I was going to wait until you finished your preliminary training, but I suppose now is as good a time as any for you to meet the troops. There are 13 more of us, but you can meet them when you're feeling better. You know me, of course," and Flint's already introduced himself. "This is Numbers," she gestured to the Zabrak who had spoken before. It was strange that this man and Master Sifu had come from the same species. Kinsa guessed they were about the same age, but they seemed completely different. For one thing, Master Sifu's skin was a pale brown, while this man's was a deep, rich red. Master Sifu's tattoos, the ones all Zabraks received upon completing their rite of passage, were thin and brown, barely visible against his light skin. No's tattoos, however, were thick and black. They seemed to take over his entire face. The skin and the tattoos, plus his bright yellow eyes, made him seem very menacing, despite the kind look he gave Kinsa now, a stark contrast to Master Sifu's warm, common face. "This is Akka." She gestured to a tall humanoid whose species Kinsa didn't recognize. He was a large man with light skin and long jet black hair. Kinsa couldn't tell how old he was. He looked young, but he had the attitude of an older, hardened warrior about him. Nathira must have seen the confusion in her face. "He's an Anzat." Kinsa stiffened immediately upon hearing this. Anzats were one of the most mysterious and dangerous species in the entire galaxy. They had long thin tentacles that were used to pierce through their victims and drain their life force. Everyone from their species were force sensitives and almost all were evil. They were said to feed off the force of other living sentients and, the stronger their victims, the more they gained from them. The oldest among them was known to have lived for over 1,000 years. No one truly knew how many of them there were. With their tentacles retracted they looked similar to humans and had no specific characteristics to identify them as anything but just another near-human species. They were also one of the oldest species in the galaxy and their home world was almost completely unexplored by members of other species. There were even unconfirmed rumors that they had some sort of telepathic ability to control their victims and explore their mind. Kinsa had to calm herself to keep from shifting away from the man. "Here we have Nanchiel." She placed her arm on the shoulder of the woman beside her. She was a Chus. Her skin was dark blue and her shining black hair was arranged in intricate braids. Her beautiful face was marred with a multitude of scars. Unlike us Darksiders who developed yellow eyes from constant use of the dark side, Nanchiel's eyes were red, one of the many defining characteristics of the Chith species. The woman glared at Nathira until the human leader removed her hand from her shoulder. Another trait customary to all Chiths was their inherent, staunch belief of superiority over all other species of the galaxy. This is Malrine. She gestured to a final woman standing to the right of Kinsa. The woman was a human, taller than Avenue Iraj with a scrawny, slight build. She had impossibly dark, ebony skin. It was so dark it seemed to reflect a sort of purplish hue. The woman's yellow eyes, the pale color overtaking the natural white sclera, shone forth from her dark, inky skin, the two orbs of light shining creepily like an animal's eyes on a dark night. Her hair was equally dark and tied in a dozen small braids, tight against her scalp. The tiny braids hung freely down her back, almost reaching her waist. The ends of the braids were each tipped with a sharp, silver cap. Besides her yellow eyes, the only color on her face came from a red tattoo. It started on the right side of her forehead and came down in a jagged line to just above her eyebrow. At first glance, Kinsa had thought it to be a scar, certainly a normal assumption with the forces of the dark side, but after looking at it for a moment she saw it was too bright and distinct to be a scar. As she looked up at the woman, she gave her a smile, revealing TWO rows of white, sharpened teeth. While Kinsa knew the smile was a gesture of kindness, the strange, unnatural teeth only served to add to the terrifying air put forth by the woman. Kinsa thought that perhaps Malrine was not a human as Kinsa had first thought, but simply a near-human species or some genetic offshoot of humans. There were dozens of such species in the galaxy. A more likely explanation, however, was that she was a human but had simply sharpened all of her exposed teeth to look like canines in order to give her a more terrifying look. If that was the case, she had certainly succeeded. Kinsa looked down from the woman's face and saw the lightsaber hanging from her belt. It was made of a bright silver metal, matching the metal on her braids, and had a multitude of crude spikes protruding from everywhere except a small area meant for grip. Clearly, this woman enjoyed being seen as a frightening figure. And, last but not least, we have Georgia. Before she could gesture him, the tiny human who looked at most 18 jumped to her, reaching out his hand to shake hers before quickly retracting it, remembering her injury. So amazing, it was probably the most amazing thing I've ever seen, he told her, talking so quickly she had a hard time understanding him. Nathira says that was your first time. There's no way, right? I was on the other side of the grounds and I could swear I got singed a bit. I think I may have lost some hair. He patted his curly, bright, orange hair quickly as if to double-check that it was all still there. Kinsa was amazed at how young he was. She couldn't imagine how well he would perform in a fight, but she supposed he must be good to be in a squad with the elites. There was a chance the seemingly infinite splotches of freckles covering his face made him look younger than he actually was. Okay, No said, seeing the overwhelmed look on her face. She's met us. Now I suggest we let her recover. Nathira nodded. Al, your equipment is back in your closet. Come find me when you're ready and we'll continue your training. You have great potential. They all turned and left her room, Georgia giving her an erratic wave and flashing her a huge smile before stepping out her door. She was glad Nos had gotten them to leave. This was all a lot for Kinsa to take in. She still had her actions from yesterday afternoon looming over her and now she had to deal with all these people she had just met. She didn't feel tired, but she also didn't feel up to getting up and facing the world just yet. She lay in her bed and stared up at the white speckled ceiling trying to sort through everything. Scene change. Naman heard reports, not only from Nathira but from all over his army, about Kinsa's amazing display of the dark side. She had apparently conjured an enormous storm of lightning that had destroyed almost the entirety of the practice range. It had caught the wood on fire and burned it to the ground, replacing the green grass with black scorched earth. He'd never expected his plan to corrupt the Jedi would work so well or so quickly. Clearly, she had more darkness within her than he had thought, and more potential. Few Jedi had ever possessed the ability to conjure even a sliver of Sith lightning, and even fewer beings in the known galaxy could create a torrent of such magnitude. He'd have to keep a closer, more personal eye on her. She could end up being of some use to him. Scene change. Kinsa stood odd in the middle of the open auditorium, her heart beating fast in anticipation of the upcoming fights. She stared across the dirt at her four opponents, Georgia, Nanchiel, a large female Selenian named Fulad, and a human man named Drek. Selenians were a large, furry, bipedal species. Fulad herself was over 2 meters tall with sleek golden brown fur covering her entire body. She had a small but useful tail that Kinsa had seen her use in combat. She had thick legs, packed with bulging muscle. The T could be seen through her fur, that allowed her to jump amazingly far and run extremely fast. While they were bipedal creatures and usually stood upright, Kinsa knew from experiences with other members of the species that they could and often did move on all fours. She was once told that they preferred not to do so in front of outsiders they didn't know because it made people see them as less intelligent, that walking on all fours made people see them as beasts. Her arms, though strong, were disproportionately short and looked like they belonged on a smaller creature. At the end of her 5 fingers were razor-sharp, retractable claws. Kinsa had never seen Fulad use them in a combat situation, but it was always something to be wary of. In her paw-like hands she held a great saber or light club. It was like a lightsaber, but the beam shot out almost twice the length of an average lightsaber. Drek was a Caucasian male with light brown, straight hair that reached down to the very tops of his ears. He stood no more than 1 3/4 meters tall, the average height for a full-grown human. His build was slightly larger than normal, though he was not at all muscular enough to draw attention or distinction. His ruddy, slightly chubby face was dusted with a light fuzz of hair and dotted with several dark brown freckles. Through means unknown to Kinsa, the man didn't have yellow eyes like the rest of his dark-side comrades, but had muddy brown irises with fully intact sclera. If there was one word Kinsa would use to describe the man on sight, it would be plain. He looked like just an average human, a face quickly forgotten that could blend easily into any crowd. The man's deceitful, unassuming nature extended also to his combat expertise. He utilized a rare and largely unknown, or at least unexpected, form of lightsaber combat called Trakata. It took advantage of the lightsaber's ability to turn off and on at will, unlike a classic sword. It was a complex fighting system that was able to confuse a more skilled opponent. Besides its extreme difficulty to master, there were other reasons it was such a rare style among both the Jedi and Sith ranks. Sith believed that their greatest strength, the thing that put them above the Jedi, was their passion. That it was their single-minded devotion and their focus on their emotions gave them the edge, not practicality. The Drakata fighting style required its user to take a step back, to fight more defensively and then wait for an opening. They couldn't use their emotions to fuel their strength because that would take away from the calculated planning that Drakata required. The Jedi staunchly refused to utilize the technique because of their misguided code of honor. The Holy Jedi refused to rely on what they saw as a deceptive tactic. The style was apparently invented by a Jedi consular and technically wasn't forbidden, but it was certainly discouraged. Drek had 2 lightsabers strapped to his belt, one red and the other a pale yellow, similar actually to the color of Kinsa's skin before she had covered herself in body paint. Even though he had 2 lightsabers, there were few times when he had both of them drawn and ignited. From what Kinsa had observed in the past, there seemed to be 2 distinct and deadly ways the man fought. The first was to would have both lightsabers in hand but not ignited. He would bob and weave, using his speed and hyper-awareness to predict and react to his opponent's attacks. Once his opponent was distracted enough, he would slip his hand in and ignite the lightsaber, changing the tide of battle instantly in his favor. The other extreme was to have his lightsabers, or at least one lightsaber, ignited and then fight normally against his opponent, allowing the normal ebb and flow of combat. As the fight went on, he would find opportune times to shut off his lightsaber, surprising his opponents and catching him or her off guard, usually forcing them to save their balance. Drek was able to use either of these extremes or anything in between to devastating effect. To an unsuspecting, unprepared opponent, the dangerous tactic spelled immediate doom, and to someone like Kinsa, someone who knew about the style and was expecting it, it meant she had to split her focus in order to avoid falling into a trap. It also meant she couldn't press as hard as normal when on the attack. If she put all her strength or speed into a sequence, it raised the chances of her being unable to react to an unexpected maneuver. Jirja, who was only 17, was the strangest of all. He wielded the strange and rare light whip. It was a purely defensive weapon that emitted a long but flexible energy blade. It was strange and confusing and could easily disorient even the most trained opponents. The young man seemed to fly across the battlefield, his feet hardly touching the ground. His whip swung erratically and seemingly randomly, somehow being everywhere at once. When she'd first seen him fight, it seemed like he was completely out of control, but she learned from watching him dismantle people that he was always in complete control. Kinsa had learned over her few weeks here that it was much more common for the elites to use strange variants of lightsabers than the average member of Rajan's army. Remember to utilize your emotions. Fight with passion, with a purpose, Nathiera told her from her spot on the wooden bleachers. Besides Nathiera and the remaining troops in her squad, about 40 members of Rajan's army dotted the stands waiting to see the fight unfold. Ever since her actions at the training ground, there had constantly been people following after her, waiting to see what she would do next. Fight with them and control them, but don't let them control you. If you become consumed by your passions, you will fly into a rage and fight like a mindless animal incapable of rational thinking. Some untrained beings fight like this, rely and cheat on their rage to overpower their enemies, but eventually they come against someone who doesn't cower at their eruptions of emotion and strength, and they're always defeated. You need to ride the line between control and anarchy to truly become a master at lightsaber combat. These words seemed so strange to her. All her time with the Jedi, she had been taught to fight devoid of emotion. That emotion led to mistakes. She had been told that, when Sith fought, they did so blinded with fury and pain. These teachings had only been reinforced when she had become a shadow. The beings she fought against charged at her wildly with reckless abandon, making dozens of foolish, haphazard mistakes. In these past weeks, she had been shown the real truth, not the Jedi's whitewashed, filtered truth. When a true Sith fought, they used their emotions but were never a slave to them. She had become stronger, faster and better than she had ever been as a Jedi. She was still a Jedi, she reminded herself. It was just different now. Now she was being matched against 4 of the elite's best fighters in a row. Fulad, who used her strength and superior range to decimate her opponents. Nanjiel, who had worked her entire life to turn herself into a near-perfect swordsman, utilizing the Makashi form of lightsaber combat, a noble dueling form created for the specific purpose of lightsaber-to-lightsaber combat. Drek, who used the cunning deceptive art of Drakata, and Jirja with his fantastic light Wii. Hey. Okay, Nanjiel, you're first. Nanjiel turned sideways and stalked forward slowly, her feet never crossing over, her lightsaber outstretched and her left hand on her hip. Instead of waiting for Nanjiel to reach her, Kinsa simply leapt to the woman, landing in front of her with a wild slash. The Chiss easily parried the blow, counter-attacking with a shallow stab. Kinsa grabbed her lightsaber with both hands and swung, using the strength to overpower the woman's weaker one-handed grip. The blue-skinned woman's lightsaber was forced outward, leaving her body exposed. Kinsa kicked out at the Chiss' stomach, knocking the wind from her lungs and forcing her to double over. Her red eyes flared with anger and she used the force to push Kinsa away, surprising her and forcing her to take a couple steps back to stabilize herself. By the time she was ready to attack again, Nanjiel was on the offensive. She came quickly with shallow stabs and measured slashes, moving too quickly for Kinsa to use her strength to overpower her. While she was extremely skilled, Nanjiel was not perfect. Her arrogance led her to believe that she was everyone's better, and Kinsa knew that if she kept her defenses up long enough, Nanjiel would get frustrated and lose control. Kinsa waited, keeping her eyes open for the first mistake. She could see frustration forming in Nanjiel's face, her brow furrowed and she gritted her teeth beneath tightly closed lips. She had never been able to defeat Kay inside combat, and Kinsa knew it was something that continually grated on her. Tired of waiting, Kinsa made her move. She slowly backed away, putting a bit of extra space between them, forcing Nanjiel to extend her attacks. After a few more seconds, she brought her guard up slowly, barely blocking Nanjiel's strike, ensuring that she would be behind on her next defense. Nanjiel saw the opportunity and she stabbed forward, extending fully to ensure her success. Kinsa, knowing the attack was coming, was able to bend backward and jump out of the way. She flipped back and, as she landed on her hands, she kicked up with her feet, connecting with the hilt of Nanjiel's lightsaber and knocking it out of her hand. Kinsa pushed off with her hands, changing direction and pushing herself forward back onto her feet instead of completing the flip. She used the momentum and extended her fist out, hitting Nanjiel in the face and dropping her to the ground. Before Nanjiel could get up, Kinsa was beside her with her lightsaber at her throat. "Done much," she declared simply. It was the Sith name for disarming or defeating an opponent without killing them, and Kinsa had to admit she got a small amount of satisfaction every time she said it. Nanjiel clenched her fists and Kinsa felt a flash of anger within her before she controlled herself. Kinsa stood straight and extended a hand to Nanjiel, who took it begrudgingly, dusting herself off and recalling her lightsaber from where it had landed. "Very good, Doreen," Nathier's voice called from the stand. "However, have a little more patience. You don't want to leave yourself purposely open. There's always the chance that you won't be able to recover and block the attack, even if you're expecting it. Fulad, you're next." The gigantic woman quickly ignited her oversized lightsaber and dashed towards Kinsa with her lightsaber pointed forward. Kinsa jumped and tucked her legs, letting the huge lightsaber pass underneath her. She stuck her foot out, connecting with Fulad's furry chin, knocking the woman's head back and continuing past her. She landed in a crouch behind the cat-like woman and immediately spun around, coming to face her opponent just in time to block a slash aimed at her chest. Instead of engaging her faster opponent, Fulad jumped back and shot the thick stream of blue lightning at her. Kinza held up her lightsaber, controlling the lightning and absorbing it with ease. While she still wasn't very comfortable with using lightning, it was still extremely traumatic whenever she attempted to. She was now able to defend against it without any trouble. Kinza felt the tingling energy spread through her as she absorbed the deadly lightning. She ran to Fulad, but was stopped by her great swinging lightsaber. She stood there, defending and attacking, trying in vain to get inside the woman's long range. She blocked a high stab and attempted to duck under her lightsaber to get into attack range, but Fulad quickly lifted her leg and kicked her back, forcing her away from her effective range of attack. Fulad stabbed at her. Kinza stepped to the side, dodged the lightsaber, and stepped forward, grabbing the woman's thick wrist. She used the force to augment her strength, and she yanked the larger woman forward. There was a moment where Kinza could have stabbed at Fulad's exposed torso with her other hand, but this was just a training exercise. No one wanted anyone to get hurt. Fulad managed to wrench her hand from Kinza's grasp, but Kinza was already inside. Now that she was close, Fulad's oversized lightsaber was a disadvantage. She swung it wildly, trying to keep up with Kinza's quick, precise strikes. Fulad was too slow on bringing her lightsaber low to block a slash aimed at her feet. Her guard was weak and it was pushed back, touching her legs for a split second and singeing her long fur. She yelped in pain and Kinza immediately jumped back, worried she had hurt the Selenian W. Oman. After checking her burned fur, Fulad brought her lightsaber back up, ready to continue the fight. "Halt!" Nathier yelled, stopping Fulad in her tracks. Doreen is twice the victor. However, Darren, you need to press your advantage when you have it. Even in a training session, you need to make sure your opponent is down, even if it means drawing a little blood. Fulad gave Kinza a small bow and extinguished her massive lightsaber. "Drek, you're up." With a calm, emotionless face, Drek stepped forward. He grabbed both lightsabers from his belt, but only ignited the one in his right hand. Kinza knew she would have to remind herself to stay focused on his left hand as well. Kinza chose not to leap into this fight. Instead, she moved slowly forward, matching Drek's speed. They clashed together, starting off with a basic exchange of attack and defense, going back and forth, neither of them pressing the attack. Kinza fought one-handed, going for light stabs and parries rather than risky, but potentially more damaging slashes. After a few seconds of relatively slow-paced combat, Kinza was moving to block a downward cut from Drek when suddenly the glowing crimson blade disappeared. There was a snap as and the lightsaber shot forth right above her head inside her guard. Panicking, Kinza swiveled her head to the side, successfully avoiding the blade. As she moved to her right, she heard another lightsaber igniting near her hip and she realized she had lost track of his deactivated lightsaber. She brought her lightsaber down to her right side and continued moving to the right, deflecting the yellow-bladed lightsaber as she moved to try and avoid his other one. She felt the burning on her shoulder as his lightsaber burned a hole in her robe and seared her skin. She stifled her scream and continued moving out of the way, pushing Drek's lightsaber away and retreating. Drek now stood facing her with both lightsabers drawn, his face still emotionless despite his successful attack. He slowly advanced towards her, swirling his lightsabers in a yellow-red whirlwind. As he moved forward, Kinza stayed still and tested her shoulder by rotating it. It stung slightly, but she didn't think it would be a serious hindrance. She ran forward, closing the distance between them instantly. She lunged forward, aiming to stab through his whirling blades. Her lightsaber was easily batted down and she had to bend back to avoid a slash from the yellow energy beam aimed at her head. They quickly fell into another pattern, this time with Kinza on the defensive, working hard to avoid his two lightsabers while keeping her mind open for a surprise attack. Drek came in from the side and somehow Kinza knew without a doubt what was coming. She brought her lightsaber to bear in an upward block and smiled as she saw his red blade extinguish. Before he could reignite it, Kinza quickly kicked out with her left leg, keeping track of his offhand with the corner of her eye. Her Fu-Ti connected with a now unthreatening lightsaber. Surprisingly, he managed to maintain his grasp on the lightsaber hilt, but his arm was forced out to the side by her kick. As she brought her foot back down, she saw his other lightsaber was coming in low to chop at her waist. Not wanting to block and risk him simply extinguishing his weapon, she jumped up, easily clearing the lightsaber as it passed under her, continuing on its path by momentum. As she came back down, Kinsa used her downward impulse to deliver a blow from above, bringing her lightsaber onto his head with some weight behind it. Drek quickly ignited his other lightsaber and brought both of his lightsabers up in an X form, catching her single blade in the crocks of his weapons. Pressing down with all her strength, Kinsa tried to overwhelm his defenses. She felt a warning flash in her mind a split second before the lightsabers disappeared completely. She pitched forward quickly and fell to the sand as Drek slid to the sea to avoid her. She held her hands out to catch herself and spun quickly to her back so she could look up at Drek as he came down on her. His sabers were once again ignited and he swung his weapons down at her, coming in simultaneously for some reason. Kinsa brought her lightsaber up dangerously close to her face so that if Drek turned off his lightsabers, they would pass by her head before he could turn them back on. Drek folded his back as he brought his lightsabers down on her. Kinsa held the hilt with both hands as his lightsaber crashed into hers, fighting to keep Drek at bay. She felt the burning heat of her own blade radiating towards her face as she struggled to push back against Drek's dual-bladed assault. Kinsa kicked out with her leg, slamming into Drek's shin. His legs were pushed back and he dropped forwards, falling down on her. Kinsa quickly rolled to the side to avoid the falling body and his wild lightsabers. With her back turned, she heard Drek grunt as he slammed into the ground. Kinsa quickly jumped to her feet and scrambled away, trying to give herself some time to recover rather than risk attacking while they were both vulnerable. Her back and shoulder ached, but besides that, she was completely fine. She watched Drek stand up slowly, the mild, unaffected look still covering his face. He began his slow march towards her, both of his lightsabers now extinguished, the hilts in hand. As she waited for him to get to her, Kinsa realized why she was failing to beat him. She had been so focused on defending against his strange style that she hadn't been thinking, she had only been reacting. She had been too distracted to think about his strategy to the fight and had instead just been sucked into the fight completely. Now that she had a moment's pause, she considered what she could do. If she continued fighting, she was certain he would eventually find an opening, surprise her and end the fight. Her advantages in combat was usually her speed and agility, heightened by her proficiency in Form 4, Adaru. In this particular fight, however, relying on her speed would lead to her downfall. Drek continued his placid walk and Kinsa realized her other advantage in this fight. While she wasn't as proficient as some counselors, she was extremely adept at using the Force. With all his focus on lightsaber combat and attention to clouding his opponent's mind, Drek had underdeveloped Force defenses. Kinsa gathered force within her as he strode towards her. She attempted to hide her growing power from Drek as he sauntered coolly towards her. Before he could attack her, she released energy in a concussive, concentrated blast. Instead of a large wave that would bowl over him, she shot a small, condensed sphere of mass at him. The invisible kinetic energy moved forward at chest height. The potent attack tore through Drek's force shield and blasted him in the chest. Drek was quickly lifted off his feet and pushed backwards. He crashed into the ground. His lightsabers were both knocked from his grasp and flew harmlessly to the side. Moving quickly, Kinsa bounded forward, reaching Drek just as he straightened himself up. Before he could recall his lightsabers, Kinsa jumped forward and kicked at him, flying through the air with her right leg outstretched. Her booted heel struck him in the chest exactly where her force attack had hit him. For the first time, his mask of indifference was broken as it transformed into a scream of pain. His cry was silenced as he was knocked back to the floor again, this time hitting his head on the ground and falling into unconsciousness. Kinsa walked over to where he lay, checking to make sure he was still breathing and wasn't too badly injured. She pressed her hand on his chest and it was still firm. Luckily, she hadn't broken anything. She rolled him to his side to look at the back of his head. He was bleeding and his hair was matted and dirty, but his skull was intact. Fulad came, lumbering over and picked up his unconscious body. "I'll take him to the med bay," she said in a deep, purring voice. Nathira nodded her agreement to Fulad, who hefted the body and walked off towards the medical tent. Jirja jumped forward and ignited his whip, staring up expectantly at Nathira. "Yes," she said with a sigh and a tiny smile, "you're next, Jirja." A wide smile was painted on his face as he turned to face Kinsa. To her, Jirja was the most confusing of all the squad. He followed HT with emotion, but, instead of rage and pain, he seemed to be fueled by boundless joy. He seemed to be the opposite of everything she had learned about Sith. He was humble, always ready to learn from others, and yet when he fought, he was a dangerous storm of energy. He flailed his whip around wildly, waiting for her to make the first move. Kinsa was wary of entering in the fray with a dangerous weapon she still couldn't predict. After a couple seconds of watching him, trying to find some pattern, she gave up. simply launching wildly at him. The small human jumped as well, meeting her in midair. Kinza reactively curled into a ball as Jirja swung his whip at her. The humming beam lashed over her head and then snapped back, coming towards her again as Jirja yanked his arm backwards. She spun in midair to face the whip and held her lightsaber out in front of her, catching the flexible beam. She had to yank her head back quickly as the end of the whip flailed past her lightsaber, flying centimeters in front of her face. She fell to the ground with a rough thud, bruising her already tired and pained body. She had been too distracted to focus on landing. She looked up to see Jirja already in the air again, jumping backwards and sending his weapon towards her once again. She was able to duck under the bright red whip and then dodge to the side as it was pulled back. Jirja quickly flicked his wrist again just as he landed, sending the writhing beam arcing towards her. She shed out lightly with the force, disrupting the trajectory of the flexible whip and knocking it back to Jirja. He let the drop to the ground, the energy beam burning the grass between them. The scourge flailed to life and launched toward her once again as Jirja flicked his wrist. Kinza brought her lightsaber up to block the whip. It came from the side and wrapped around her lightsaber, creating a strange sizzling sound as they touched. Kinza yanked her arm back with all her strength, trying to use her strength to pull the handle from the younger man's hands. Jirja surprised her with his strength, however, holding tightly to the metal hilt. Instead of his weapon shooting at her, he jumped up and was hauled forward towards her. As he neared her, Kinza swung her leg out, aiming to kick him in the ribs. Her foot connected with his side, but it didn't seem to affect him. He continued flying towards her, his legs bent back and his knees pointed out. His knees connected with her chest and knocked her to her back. They fell together in a tangle of arms and legs, and it took a moment for them to spring to their feet and separate. Jirja backed away from her, covering his retreat by flicking his whip in her face, keeping her from chasing him. They stood regarding each other for a moment, about 4 meters between them. The curling red beam lay on the ground at his side as Jirja bounced on the balls of his feet, a smile still covering his face. Kinza breathed deeply, calling on the force, leaning on it just to keep her standing. Jirja seemed to have endless energy. Kinza took a deep breath, letting the force wash through her and rejuvenate her tired muscles. She launched forward with long strides. Jirja stayed still and brought his whip up and flung it at her face. She saw the whip as it moved towards her. Judging the distance, she continued running, blowing by the energy beam, leaving it behind her, trying to close the gap and getting close to Jirja. She heard he whip snap behind her as she closed in on him. She instinctively ducked as she ran, assuming from experience his strike would be aimed for her head. She was within 2 meters of Jirja when she felt a burning heat against her heel. The whip slashed at her Achilles tendon as it flew past her, cutting through her tough leather boots and burning her skin for a moment before rushing past her and flying back to Jirja. She took a step forward, but found she couldn't put weight on her foot. Her leg collapsed and she pitched forward, falling onto her face. She brought her arms up to protect her face. She was about to slam into the dirt when she felt herself stop suddenly. She looked up to see Jirja, a concerned, focused look on his face with his hands stretched out towards her, channeling the force to keep her from falling forward. Kinza extended her hands out so they touched the ground and Jirja released her. She stood up, putting her weight on her left foot. Jirja's smile returned to his face as he saw she was okay. "I still win," he declared, whirling to look at Nathiera for confirmation. Nathiera laughed aloud. "Yes, Jirja, you win." Kinza felt a pang of pain in her heart as she looked at Jirja's young, innocent face. She didn't believe he was capable of hurting anyone. He had been training all his short life to become the best warrior he could be, and he was one of the best she had ever seen, but he had never seen real combat. All his experience was in training duels like this one, and it hurt Kinza to think about what would happen when the battle was joined. Either he would be unable to truly fight and be killed quickly, or he would fight, killing, she was sure, many Jedi, corrupting him and turning him into something evil before he was finally put down. She couldn't help but imagine how it all could have been different if he had been born in another part of the galaxy. If the Jedi had found him before it was too late, everything would have been so much better for him. "Doreen," Nathiera called down from the stands. "Come and talk with me. The rest of you continue your training." She gestured to the 19 other members of their squad to pair off together. Scene change. They sat high in the bleachers, looking down as the rest of Kinza's squad trained together, pairing off and going through attack and defense sequences until they became second nature. After training enough on a specific sequence, it became muscle memory and you could attack and defend without even hardly thinking about it, which left your mind free to plan ahead and try to predict your opponent's next moves or use force powers. Nathira broke the thoughtful silence, pulling Kinsey's attention away from the men and women fighting below. You are an amazing lightsaber duelist. You came to us with great skill and knowledge, and you've advanced quicker than anyone I've ever seen. Thank you, Kinsey replied, bowing her head. She waited for the "but" that was surely coming. Aang. However, Nathira continued. Close enough, Kinsey thought to herself. You still seem to be holding back. It seems as if your mind is focused partially on something else while you're fighting. If you just gave it your all, if you just let yourself go, you could be amazing. There was no doubt in Kinsey's mind what Nathira was referring to. It was her force signature. Through all this time, in everything she'd been doing, she had been focusing on keeping the light side within her bottled up. It had become slowly easier and easier, she assumed, just because she was getting used to doing it, and it could be placed further back in her mind, but still she had to pay some attention to it. And your emotions, Darren continued. You're delving into them and using them, but not correctly. In these last fights, you didn't draw anything up to fuel you, not even once. With you, it's like you either keep them shut away or you release them completely, like a dam bursting, then they rush up, you and take control. Remember what I said earlier? You need to control your emotions, and, contrary to what you seem to believe, controlling your emotions doesn't mean keeping them shut away. That's not true control. You need to learn to turn the valve just a little, to open a steady stream of emotions and passions that can empower you and make you better. That is true control. Once again, the truth of the Jedi was revealed to her. She had been told that followers of the dark side cheated their way to power, relying on dark emotions for their strength, but now she saw that the Jedi were just afraid. They were afraid of their emotions and uncertain of their ability to control them, so they tried to lock them away. She almost laughed aloud. They were afraid, and was fear itself not an emotion? An emotion the Jedi themselves claimed led to the dark side. In the very core of their teachings, their hypocrisy was revealed yet again. As more truth was revealed, she realized that the Jedi were not truly practitioner of the light side. She wasn't, of course, saying the Sith were the light side, but she was beginning to see the Jedi weren't either. The dark side used emotions like fear, anger, jealousy, arrogance, and hate to fuel their force. The light side should use emotions like love, kindness, hope, pride, courage, and joy to fuel their control over the force. Instead, the Jedi used nothing. They took all emotions, good and bad, and shut them away for fear that they may be led to the dark side, but, in doing that, they stayed closer to the dark side than if they embraced good emotions. They were too weak and too afraid to try and sort through their emotions to find those that could be used for good. Kinsey had always wondered why it seemed like Sith were naturally more powerful than Jedi, and now she knew. It was because it wasn't a fight against light side and dark side, it was a fight between the dark side and, she didn't even know what. Some kind of neutral, bland non-color that didn't even have a side. Her eyes drifted to Jirja as he fought, easily keeping Rick, a larger human with a double-bladed lightsaber, at bay. This, she thought, was the light side. Jirja fought with emotion, but no dark evil emotions, rather with pure joy and simply for the love of fighting. Doreen? Nathira questioned, interrupting Kinsey's revelatory thoughts. Kinsey asked. She thought she must have missed something. I asked what it was that was holding you back. What is stopping you from using your emotions? Fear, Kinsey replied honestly. I've kept my emotions smothered to protect myself from them. It's easier for me to keep them at a distance than to try and deal with them, than to try and control them. Nathira laughed. And is fear not an emotion? She asked, echoing Kinsey's thoughts. And a weak one at that. One that has no place in a fighter's heart. You must take your fear and transform it, turn it into rage that will fuel you. Kinsey dismissed this immediately. She knew now she didn't need rage to defeat her enemies. She would use her own emotions, the emotions that would lead her to the light side. I understand, she said, nodding. She still needed to keep some secrets. There was a short pause when Nathira clearly expected her to excuse herself and go back to training, but Kinsey saw this moment as an opportunity to get some information. So, I know this cult is apparently pretty old, but the idea to fight the Jedi is relatively recent. What was happening here before all that? She asked. It all started with our new leader, the one you met on the first day. Our old leader, Greif, didn't actually seem to have any goal in mind, but was just happy being able to call himself leader. He issued an open challenge that anyone who could defeat him in a duel would become the leader. Many tried and they all failed. No one even came close until the Lord Marshal. Was he that good? Kinsey interrupted. Rogan had been a good fighter, but she couldn't imagine he'd improved enough to defeat the highly trained Force user. Nathiera shrugged. Griff was good but not as good as he thought. Almost half of the people that are training below us probably could have defeated him. Most just honestly didn't see the point. Being the leader during that time didn't mean much. I'm not so sure about the new one though. I saw him fighting and Griff never even had a chance. I know I wouldn't want a chance fighting him. He never actually dissolved Griff's policy, but it doesn't matter. I think he knows no one would challenge him to a duel after what he did to Griff. Besides, now we actually have a purpose and killing him would just serve to tear an important cog out of that plan. Everyone here seems happy enough with his leadership. Keenza nodded along as Nathiera spoke. Again, she was surprised at the dark side cult, this time surprised how well they were working together. She'd imagined it would be full of infighting and CK stabbing, assassins sneaking into Rajan's tent to slit his throat while he slept most every night. In reality, it seemed like this cult had more cooperation and agreement than the Jedi.